Okay, good morning, everyone. It is the top of the hour, 10 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. And so we might have a few more people chiming in a few minutes, but that's okay. But I wanted to go ahead and get started and welcome everyone to another webinar in the series of webinars we've been holding in the last couple of weeks. Um, Today, this morning's webinar will concentrate on facilitating online discussions. And this is a really cool topic because when it comes to online learning, this is really the most common pedagogical strategy used in the online classroom. It's kind of the meat and potatoes, I like to call it, of online learning. I don't think I've ever been involved in a class that did not utilize some form of threaded discussion. But being that as it is, it's also been in my experience just from teaching the IDLE course that it also can be the most challenging to accomplish. How many of you all, kind of in the chat box, let me know, how many of you all have experience developing or facilitating asynchronous discussion forums? Just kind of gauge your experience level. Good, good, good. And I see a lot of you have none or some. And that's why it can be so challenging because most of us, including myself, before I really got involved in online learning, we were probably more geared towards the face-to-face classroom. So that's kind of where our expertise lies. When we switch over to online learning, because we understand in online learning, you can't just dump a course, a face-to-face, into an online environment and expect it to be successful. We have to really develop and learn about and understand what facilitating an online discussion is all about. And something I actually learned about this as well is this is actually somewhat mandated federally for since 1992 from the Department of Education office, the Inspector General. It's actually a regulation that specifically states that online courses must include regular and substantive interaction. And the thread discussions is just a way of satisfying that mandate. So before we actually get into the lesson itself, I just want to introduce myself real quick and kind of introduce you to the team. I'm Mr. Frank Rosenkrantz. I've been in the education and training environment for quite a while when I was in the Air Force. Of the 23 years I spent in the Air Force, half of those years probably were in AETC at some level, teaching at tech school and also teaching at the NCO Academy. And then even as a civilian, I did work for FEMA as a training specialist for a while before coming back to the training group as an instructor at the 336, and then finding my way to FACD, where I've been for a while now, teaching the BIC course and now the IDLE course. Joining me are Miss Brittany Hall and Miss Monica Garcia. Please, they are both very well versed in this subject matter as well. So they will kind of be interacting with you and chatting with you. So by all means, if you have questions, please ask. They will respond to them, and kind of so we can make this more interactive. Again, I'll kind of throw in some questions here and there, but we really want to encourage participation in this webinar, and kind of it helps create knowledge for all of us because I don't know everything. So I garner information, I learn from you just as well. So today on the agenda, we will first we'll follow a somewhat logical approach when it comes to the discussion forums. First, we'll look at the purpose. What the desired outcomes are. Why do we facilitate these discussions in the first place, and how do they help the course? Then once we understand the purpose, we will get into a little of the design and development. We will concentrate on the construction. What makes a good discussion question? What to help make facilitate an effective forum? because after all, the questions really drive the discussion. So we have to make sure we're asking the right types of questions in order to satisfy what we need from our students in a given course. So once we get that, now we can really put it into action, the facilitation part, facilitating actual online discussion. The concentration, the focus will be on the asynchronous types of discussion forums because those are the most prevalent in your online learning. So we'll focus on how to manage those asynchronous discussion forums and try to get the most out of it as we facilitate those forums. And then lastly, I'm just going to touch on some new approaches. I said discussion forums traditionally is instructor asks a question of some type and then the student answers it. There are some new approaches to that, and we'll kind of touch on a few of those at the end of the lesson. So the first thing we'll talk about is the purpose, the overall outcome. So when you think of the purpose of a threaded discussion, in a few words, you don't have to type a lot, just in a few words in the chat box, if you could, can you think of any advantage a online threaded discussion forum has over face-to-face? I mean, what's the advantage from one versus the other? Okay. Yes, because the courage to speak up is a good point because you have to speak up. No public speaking, yeah. So some people that express themselves written better might have the advantage there. Ah, Anna, I like that. Gives them ample time to think. We'll actually touch on that specifically. Developing those responses. Less pressure, absolutely. So yes, you guys are hitting on some of the very things that I'll be touching on as well as far as purpose. Overall, we're looking at the outcome. One of the primary purposes is demonstration of knowledge. As instructors, kind of going back, if you talk about roles of the instructor, this is the instructor role. We are tasked with knowledge creation. So in the third discussion, we want to be able to gauge the level of understanding our students have based on how they're responding. So that's kind of an overall desired outcome. But like some of you have mentioned, it does develop critical thinking skills. Put in a real world context, students have time to think and formulate their thoughts. Unlike a face-to-face classroom, a lot of times if a instructor throws out a question, especially if it's a direct question to a student, they have to think on the spot and really try to formulate their thoughts coherently, quickly. Where a threaded discussion, the students have time to think and formulate those thoughts. So in that aspect, also it helps them in problem solving. If you pose questions where the students really have to try to figure something out and solve a problem. So it helps in that aspect. Or if they have to make decisions based on a discussion, it might force them to try to make a decision one way or the other. So those are all ways it can help develop those critical thinking skills, those constructive knowledge skills. And writing, believe it or not, because you're so heavily inundated with writing in a forum environment, it does develop those writing skills. It allows the students to write coherently and putting their thoughts in a written format. So that's actually one of the benefits that you can garner from an online discussion. And then one of the more important ones is the community building. In that asynchronous interactivity, you're essentially trying to recreate a classroom environment. But since you do not have the benefit of discussing in real time in a classroom, this is kind of used to recreate that classroom environment and build community through good discussion forums. So these are some of the purposes of the whys of the discussion forum and facilitating those asynchronous discussions. So now we understand the purpose. We really have to look at what we can do to help make it happen overall. For that, we'll look at the design and development of a good discussion forum. And first and foremost, we have to consider the goals and objectives. We have to really figure out what we should be asking, meeting the goals and objectives based on the Bloom's taxonomy. How many of you are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy of learning? Probably most of you have heard of it or are familiar with it, because that plays a big part. And later on, I'll actually show a chart that aligns the type of learning according to Bloom's taxonomy. But that's a big part of it. But we want to really ask the right questions so we understand what skills, what knowledge or perspectives or insight, what do we want the students to walk away with? So asking that right question is paramount. And it kind of takes me to an analogy. I read something a couple of weeks ago that kind of explained it perfectly. It's from if any of you are old enough to remember the old Pink Panther series, the movies that were made, there's a scene that kind of really illustrates what I'm talking about. Inspector Clouseau and a hotel clerk are standing by a door, and there's a dog next to the clerk. And Clouseau asks, "Does your dog bite?" And the clerk says, "No." So as he reaches down to pet the dog bites him. And Clouseau is perplexed. He's like, "I thought you said your dog doesn't bite." And the clerk says, "That's not my dog." So essentially, that's an example of someone not asking the right type of question. He didn't want to know if his dog bit. He wanted to know if that dog sitting next to him did. So that's kind of an example of what I'm talking about. So when it comes to actually the questions, there are several types of questions, and this is not an all-inclusive list, but really what I like to point out is when we're asking questions, keeping in mind we're trying to facilitate thinking and critical thinking. So we have to be very aware of what type of questions we're asking. The what, the who's, the where's, the how, the why. We want to make sure we get what we need from our students. So these are some types for if going back to Bloom's taxonomy, if you remember, the lowest level is really the knowledge level, and exploratory type questions generally satisfy that. They probe facts, just basic knowledge, describe, identify, list, label, match, very basic type questions if that's what we desire the outcome to be according to the proficiency level which we're going to. I always like to point out with your exploratory questions, since they are knowledge level questions, they are sometimes very difficult to integrate into a discussion forum. Only because, remember, the purpose of a discussion forum is the word discussion. And it can be very challenging to try to create a exploratory question or a level A question that can truly spark discussion. It's not impossible, but it can be challenging. Always one suggestion I have for if you are in that realm where you have a lot of just basic knowledge type objectives and you're trying to integrate it into a discussion, you can try to make an activity out of it. Maybe some small groups. You can split your class up online in small groups and then charge them or task them with compiling a lot of information. Again, that's that knowledge level. They're just compiling information. And then maybe get together to share that information. Those are just some ideas, but truth be told, it can be difficult, or I would say it's more difficult to create a good discussion question if you're just going to the knowledge level. So but not impossible. Whereas your relational type questions, these are more comprehension, classifying, discussing, explaining, generalizing. So this type of question lends itself more in that type of environment where you're really discussing and thinking. Your compare and contrast, your cause and effect kind of fit into the relational category of questions. And that's what we see a lot with your B type, your comprehension type questions. You also can use your priority questions. Priority questions really, you're seeking for the students to identify what's most important in an issue. So they're prioritizing maybe some principles learned from level of importance to most important and least important. And you can kind of ask questions and to help gauge whether they understand what's more important, what's less important. Those are what we call your priority type questions. Your challenge questions kind of fall more in your analysis, where they're interrogating assumptions or conclusions or interpretations. You could have your how would you explain type questions. What is the meaning of this, that, or the other? So the student now is kind of breaking down the information and inferring or reasoning the what the information means. Your hypothetical questions pose kind of a change in the facts. So with the change in certain issues, there's some synthesis going on where the students formulating the information, integrating it or reconstructing it, trying to maybe create something new depending on the form or how the hypothetical question is laid out. Then your diagnostic kind of delves more into your evaluation type questions, your conclusions, interpretation, judging and justifying points of views or reinterpreting them. Your diagnostic questions also again are your more higher level questions, your evaluation type questions. These are good to use also when you're doing an activity you can do for your diagnostic, your evaluation type questions are peer reviews. I always find those very beneficial or that work very well in that type of learning environment if you're trying to get them to evaluate, to where they're looking at each other's work and can interpret it and judge it based on what they've learned in the course. So these are some of the question types that you can ask. And again, this is not an all-inclusive list, just some of the more popular ones that you'll see most often. Now, there's definitely some things you want to avoid when it comes to asking questions, and we'll look at some of those, because in my experience teaching the EIDL course, because in the EIDL course we do have a activity where the students have to, or a lesson where the students actually have to formulate a question, and sometimes we'll see a lot of this. One is the run-on question, and this is when there's just too many questions in the threaded discussion questions. For those who have taken online courses, have you ever ran into this where you see a question and it's just very long? It strings together multiple questions and the questions kind of go into different directions, so it can leave the student really confused trying to figure out which question to address first or at what level. Yes, very painful. We want to avoid that. I know from a personal experience, the worst experience I've had with this, I had a class where the student had, or the instructor asked in one question, it was one thread discussion question, but he incorporated 22 questions within it. So it was really like answering 22 separate questions. And to top it off, what really made me want to just like, I'm done with this class, no more than 350 words. That in itself was a challenge to try to answer. And these were not yes, no, one or dead end questions. These were essay type questions. And he had like 22 of them combined into one. So try to avoid that. That's like Mark said, that it's very painful and frustrating for the student, which kind of takes us into the yeah, maybe he did. Funny, the thesis. The dead end questions. These are questions that don't really stimulate any type of critical thinking or encourage participation. Just yes or no. If you're going to use a dead end, at least follow it up. If you're asking yes or no, like, do you think this principle is more important than that? And then why? Add that why next to it. That way it forces the student to expound on it, because it's really difficult for those close-ended one-word questions, what color represents this? How do you really critically think about that? Because the answer is what it is. If the answer is red, the answer is red. What's there to discuss unless you add some type of follow-up and or question to that? And even opinion questions, we see this a lot when we're teaching EIDL, and a lot of the questions sometimes the students come up with, they'll ask like some opinion but without any support. If you're going to ask an opinion question, which is fine, at least it shouldn't be a gut feeling. There should be some type of support to back up whatever that student is presenting, other than I just feel this way because I feel this way. I really don't know why. Support it with something that relates to whatever the topic of the lesson is. Your leading questions, try to avoid those because it really conveys an expected answer. So you would never like ask a question like, why is Merrill's instructional theory better than Gagne's? As the instructor, I'm telling you that Merrill's instructional theory is better than Gagne's by putting that in the question. Don't you think that Merrill is better than Gagne? It kind of conveys what I'm expecting you to say. We want to stay away from that. Sometimes it lends itself to the instructor's bias, those types of questions. Or your slanted questions. If I were to ask, well, why are millennials lazy? That's a very slanted question. Well, maybe they're not. So by asking a question like that, it's making it very slanted, and generally we want to stay away from that. They are. See what I mean? Here we go. They are. So again, stay away. And then some of the worst are those vague questions. They're very general or unfocused. If I were to ask, what happened to the weather career field within the last 10 years? Well, that's very vague and confusing. And generally the students, it creates frustration in the students if the questions really aren't explained very well or are not specific enough. So that's one rule of thumb. Be as specific as possible when you're exactly, it changed. And believe it or not, that would be a response. It changed, because the students would realize, well, that's kind of a general vague question, so I'll answer it just as vaguely. It changed, or it changed a lot. So that's why we want to be specific in our questions so that we can be assured that the answer we get falls into what we want the outcome to be. Because I've come across a lot of those vague questions where I'm asking myself, what is the instructor really looking for? What do they want out of this? So those are some of the things we want to avoid. So next, I want to look at the question itself. So we looked at the types of questions and what we don't want to do, but now we really want to focus on the writing the question itself, how to construct a question, a good question that will help facilitate an online discussion. First and foremost, the verbs, action verbs. That helps the student understand exactly what your expectations are. Describe something, compare something, discuss something. And in the digital age, there are actually some specific action verbs, which I'll show you on a chart here shortly. The next is readability and clarity. Don't try to create a question that's too technical or too over the top. It should be very clear and readable. And here the focus really is also on the understanding, really. So make sure your sentence structure is well laid out. The word familiarity, make sure students are familiar with the words, includes grammar, punctuation, just making sure that it's very readable and clear. And then the personalized, what I'm really talking about here is when you're creating a question, try to structure it in a way where the student can, for themselves, explore different ways or personal ways they can use the information in more real world context. So you might ask, discuss the principles of leadership, and then how are they demonstrated in your work center. That way it personalizes it to them. They can now critically think about the principles of leadership that were discussed in the course and apply those specifically to their personal work center. So that's a good strategy to use when you're writing your questions. Try to integrate something that allows the student to share their own personal experiences or relate the information into their real world context. And this really supports one of Merrill's first principles of instruction. I really like Merrill a lot because he really promotes this whole real putting things into a real world context. That tends to enhance the learning, because if you're putting it into something you can relate to, it generally helps you learn the information and understand the information. Now, I mentioned those action verbs, and I came across a chart, which is kind of cool. This comes from Teach Thought, and it kind of breaks down Bloom's taxonomy digital planning verbs, because now that we're online, there's some additional verbs that we can look at, such as Googling, journaling, podcasting. And if you look at the remembering all the way to creating, if you look through a lot of those planning verbs, it kind of discusses a lot of you can use for face-to-face, but there are a few that are kind of exclusive to the online environment, like wiki building, podcasting, the programming. So this is a kind of nice little chart to kind of help you when you're formalizing or when you're constructing your questions, kind of what types of verbs you can use according to the learning level you're trying to get your students to reach. And kind of further on clarity, we also need to look at expectations when it comes to what we expect our students to do. This really helps mitigate a lot of the confusion and ambiguity, because a lot of times what we see, even in the courses I teach, sometimes students just misunderstand directions or they're unsure of expectations. Sometimes we assume, oh, as far as a copy of the chart, we will be sending out the slide deck to everybody that's in participating in this webinar, so you will definitely get a copy of that. Now, when it comes to like I said, the expectations, we want to make sure students understand what we want. A lot of times we might read instructions and it makes perfect sense to us, but when the student reads it, it's confusing to them. So we have to make sure we pay attention to that. One of the things, remember, this goes back to being specific, what I talked about earlier, is the length of a post. Now, in your opinion, I'll just ask you all this. When it comes to length of a post, do you prefer word count or sentence count? Which one do you think works better, word count or sentence count? Word count. That's the overwhelming preference, and I would concur with that. And the reason is only because I've experienced this when we had sentence counts. We actually had sentence counts in the course, and we would say, like, okay, in 5 sentences, or minimum of 5 sentences, explain this, that, or the other. Well, students sometimes will, a lot of students, they'll do what they need to do, the bare minimum. So they'll literally write 5 sentences. I like this course, period. I think it's good, period. There's 2 right there. So it tends to make it a little easier for students to really not do what we want as far as an outcome. So yes, I do prefer word counts. Generally, in my experiences when it comes to the initial post, word counts generally range from 300 to 400 words, and then the peer responses, of course, generally like 200 words. But that really depends on what your expectations are as far as the instructor. But definitely I recommend a minimum and maximum word count, because I've seen that as well, where we have a minimum word count of, let's say, 200 words, and then the student decides to write a dissertation in one post, which can be very hard to kind of get through and grade. So definitely recommend a minimum or a max, just a window, 350 to 400 words. That way, again, clear expectations for the student. There's no gray area. There's no I don't get it. I know this post needs to be between 350 or 400 words. So that helps with that expectations. And even in your initial post criteria, try to put as much as possible as far as specifics. Or do they need to include any resources? Do they have to put citations? Or do they have to use examples from the textbook? Make sure that whatever requirements exist, you put them in the question itself. A lot of times we just assume the student knows what to do, and we'll see a very short 30 discussion questions. Explain the three elements of this. Help if you add, include any type of reference material, resources, web links. If those are required, make sure those are included. And as far as the peer responses, also, sometimes what you want to avoid in a peer response is, after you've laid out the question really nicely, and then at the bottom you'll say, respond to two peers. That's very, again, what's the requirement? What's the criteria? Make sure they understand that the responses should be constructive responses, substantive responses, meaningful responses, and even add a word count to those responses, and make it as specific and explicit as you can. And the last thing, the naming conventions, it might seem a little, well, naming conventions, when I talk naming conventions, I'm meaning, titles, what to put in the subject line, things of that nature. Again, anything that can help the student make sure they're clear on expectations. This is probably one of the biggest areas that's neglected that I've experienced in teaching a lot of this stuff, and in experiencing it myself in the classroom. I'm actually going through a class right now where the instructor is not very clear on what the expectations are, and it's very frustrating if you don't know exactly what's expected, so that you can provide what you need to the instructor. So definitely, I like to highlight that as a issue, or something that's very important and critical when it comes to discussion questions, those expectations. So now we understand the purpose, how to develop them. Now we need to get into the action, the actual facilitation of the course itself. So this is now the instructor managing or facilitating the actual discussion forum. And three things I like to point out: adaptive, flexible, and responsive. Those are really important highlights when it comes to facilitation. Adaptive, because a lot of times discussion forums can be unpredictable, because we don't really know sometimes what to expect. Where compared to, let's say, a written test or something where we know what the answer is, in this type of environment, we have to be ready to adapt to the discussion and the direction that it's going to, and be flexible enough to be able to kind of drift in and out from one area to the next comfortably. Kind of have that flexibility, because of the unpredictable nature sometimes of these discussion forums. We have to do that. And then responsive, really meaning just that. We have to make sure we respond to our students. This harkens back to social support, or social presence, I should say. from the instructor point of view, making sure that we're as instructors, making sure that the students see us and understand that we are virtual instructors, but we are present, and by being responsive to what the students are saying and doing, we kind of support the whole concept of social interaction and social presence. A couple things I'd like to point out is, and I'm not going to get into the netiquette because I covered that in my last webinar, just a quick blurb on that. Make sure your netiquette guidelines are available so the students are behaving properly, and also settings. There's some options too, and this is more preference. I've seen both ways. You can set your course up to where the student cannot see other people's posts until they actually post their own initial post. And this kind of helps with a lot of kind of plagiarism or looking at everybody else and just creating a hybrid from what they said into your own post. So to avoid that, I know there's a lot of courses that will not allow you to see other students' posts until you have posted your own. Again, personal preference, and a lot of times depending on the institution and how they kind of run that aspect. So when it comes to the facilitation, one thing we want to do is support that interaction because it is a interactive environment. And engaged thinking, we really want to emphasize the engaged thinking. So it's not all about just finding the right answer. Yes, finding the answer and supporting what you found is a component, but the emphasis should be on engaged thinking. When we're monitoring what our students are saying or how they're posting their information, are we seeing evidence that they are critically thinking about the content of the material versus just finding an answer to a question? So that's really important when it comes, and it helps support that interaction. Surrendering that control can be difficult, especially if we have a background that is face-to-face and we're used to the traditional lecture type environment. It can be somewhat difficult to sometimes surrender that control, letting go of that need to know everything and all the answers. That's why we have the discussion forum. We're allowing the students to discuss themselves, to garner knowledge through that discussion, through that critical thinking. That doesn't mean we don't interject, because I'll go later into specific times when we will do that, but kind of pick your spots when it comes to interjecting yourself into discussion and to what level you will inject yourself. We want to support that active learning. So, kind of step back and just monitor, observe, and control the flow of the thread discussion versus dominating the thread discussion. And peer reviews is another way of promoting that intellectual engagement and critical thinking. I mentioned that earlier when you're trying to get to the evaluation level of Bloom's taxonomy. Allow your students to maybe create projects or produce something where the other peers can literally review, maybe using a checklist of some type, review each other's work. And again, that sparks that creative thinking, that creates that interaction when you allow the students to use the information learned from the course and now apply it constructively within the discussion forum. So those are some ways we can support that interaction. As far as our own interaction, monitoring and interaction, there is one time when you as the instructor would want to insert yourself 100% of the time, and that would be the introduction post. And that is generally up front, some type of icebreaker where the student introduces themselves, maybe gives a little background about who they are and what they do. Those are, at that time, Always in. You should answer every single student that introduces themselves. It's because it's at the beginning of the course and you want to set a positive tone of that social presence. It kind of welcomes the student to the course, kind of puts them a little at ease and breaks the ice, hence icebreaker. So saying, welcome to the course, and maybe look at what they posted and relate something, and just welcome them and generally and make them feel comfortable within that environment. Because believe it or not, there are a lot of students that are hesitant in the online environment, that might be a little intimidated, especially if they're not extremely tech savvy or don't have or have very little experience in the in an online environment. You really want to attack it early and upfront. So by introducing or welcoming them, it kind of helps do that. The other time is assistance. If the student has an issue or a problem, you should be available. And remember, we talked about being responsive. Here's an instant. Be responsive. Get with that student and help answer their question. This is extremely frustrating if this doesn't happen. Again, unfortunately, the course I'm taking right now, I'm experiencing this. I'm asking questions and I'm not getting any responses. It's almost like I'm being a bother, like stop bothering me with all these questions. But I'm seeking clarification. We have to be responsive. We it's so easy for us to assume, because if you're very familiar with the subject matter, you know it inside out. It's hard to differentiate. Remember, this is their first time. They don't know it as well as you. So we can't just assume, like, why don't they get this? It's so I put it in the instructions. It's so easy. Yes, to you, but to them, they might be misinterpreting something or misunderstanding. Just be there for the student and help them out in a timely manner with anything they need. This helps build that community and interaction. And it's not a bad idea. This I've seen this done sometimes, where students or the instructor might summarize some key points, especially with a larger class. If you have 30, 40 students, it can be a little daunting to create original posts for everybody. So you might, in that case, monitor the entire discussion. And then just at the end, maybe summarize, highlighting a few of the main points that the students, maybe there was a consensus on something, some areas that they really highlighted a lot, maybe summarize at the end. This has been a great discussion. You guys seem to realize that the principles of this, that, and the other are important, blah, blah, blah. Just kind of to kind of give an overall summarization without getting too instruction type. You don't want to teach the lesson. You just want to highlight what they have said, not necessarily what you think, but kind of summarize the key points from the discussion itself. So next, I want to look at some routine tasks. And when I say routine tasks, these are times, where we as instructors will put ourselves into the discussion, but it has to be purposeful. You don't want to inject yourself into a discussion thread unless you have an actual purpose to. So you have to really look at what the students are saying and then determine, well, which one of these types of tasks, and we'll look at 5 of them, would be appropriate at this time. And one is shifting the view. Now, when I say shift the view, you might be monitoring discussion threads, and you notice that the students are only focused on one thing, and they're all talking about the same thing. And if you, as the instructor, are trying to kind of shift the direction of the conversation, you might inject yourself by asking a question, a simple question. Group, here's another while I'm talking about that. When you are injecting yourself into a thread discussion as an instructor, it should address whatever you're saying to everybody involved in that thread. You don't want to just address it to one person, because that then excludes everybody else. Because if you say, Jerry, explain to me this, that, or the other, then Jerry's the only one that answers. you want to try to be inclusive. Now, it doesn't mean you can't mention someone by name. You might say, Mark uh, mention this, that, or the other. What do you all think about this? Again, that's trying to maybe shift the view. Or has anybody ever thought of looking at from this perspective? And by asking a specific question, you're now moving the conversation from one place to another. If you notice that it's just going one direction, and you, as the instructor, are trying to get the students to see things a different way. So that's one of the routine tasks, the shifting the view. The other is generate deeper understanding. You might be monitoring the discussion forum and noticing that it's very superficial. They're not really going too deep, or maybe you're even noticing that they're not really understanding it to the level that it needs to be understood. Here, you can insert yourself again and maybe offer up something to help generate a deeper understanding of the material. Whether it's, you can cite a textbook, maybe some type of reference, or an online source, like, hey, everybody look at this website. It really goes in depth about the principles of instruction, or maybe exploring different implications. Ask them for support, ask them for more evidence of what they're saying, because by asking for evidence, it forces them to dig a little deeper into what they're saying. So maybe kind of you can approach it in that manner. Follow-up questions are great to kind of push those students to think about things a little more deeply. And I've had instructors that did this for me, and it really helped a lot. I'd have an initial post, and they would follow it up with whatever I said. They'd ask me to kind of go a little deeper into it. So offering those those sites, textbooks, or articles, journals, to kind of help them gain a deeper understanding of the material. Developing a new frame of reference. Here you can maybe compare peer-to-peer postings with your own or others' knowledge. So you might look at a couple postings and compare and contrast them to one another, and then compare it to your own knowledge about this subject. Suggest maybe some alternative methods and procedures but you want to be careful not to judge their conclusions. So even if they might be going in the wrong direction, without being too harsh on what they said, try to kind of help them develop a new frame of reference by suggesting some other alternative ways or methods of how they answered their question. The highlighting tensions is have to be careful with as well. Now, highlighting tensions, there in a online discussion, sometimes there's debate. Some topics can be somewhat controversial, and constructive debate is not a bad thing. People can learn a lot about that. You have to make sure it remains productive and within the context of the learning environment. But you can definitely highlight those tensions, maybe consider some different perspectives, or you yourself compose a conflicting question, kind of play devil's advocate. And everybody's saying this, but what about this? I think this should be the priority. So kind of, again, why are we doing this? Remember the critical thinking. We want them to think about things critically and really evaluate what they're saying. So this is just a strategy, a technique rather, where we can do this to kind of highlight those questions. And as far as the modeling effective feedback, here we as instructors can help encourage that participation constructively by building on the contributions of the students, by asking for clarification. And when it comes to, as instructors, we might disagree with what a student is saying, which is fine. We just maybe want to disagree politely instead of saying, you're way off base, I don't even know why you're in my class. Maybe more tactfully address the situation. I think there's some misunderstanding, maybe because maybe they read the material and they just totally misunderstood or misread something, but we want to address it in a productive manner. So we ourselves want to model effective feedback. So in our feedback, we want to make sure that it contributes to their learning and their clarification and understanding of the material. So these are some of the 5 routine tasks that you can use to kind of help you get a better understanding of, okay, I know I need to insert myself at times into a thread discussion, but what am I trying to get? What am I looking for when I'm inserting myself? And these routine tasks can kind of help you as the instructor um, understand when and why you should inject yourself into that discussion. Okay, one of the last things I really want to look at next is new approaches. The threaded discussion has been around for a long time. That is the dominant method used when it comes to making sure that there's interaction going on between students. But over the years, there's some new approaches have kind of come up, and I kind of looked for some of these. And again, this is not an all-inclusive list, just kind of some of the things I found. One is a voice thread. This is very exciting to me. I think this is really cool. A voice thread is essentially using video posts as opposed to writing, or maybe just given the option. As mentioned earlier from you all in the chat, I think, Mark, you said that it avoids the public speaking as far as the benefit of thread discussion. So whoever is weak at public speaking has an advantage by writing. But what about the other way around? What if the person is a poor writer but a great speaker? Maybe offer that as an alternative, that voice thread. If you're going to try this, I recommend try it with the icebreaker, the introductions. We actually did this in the IDLE course. We were kind of experimenting and trying it out. We use Flipgrid, where we had the students, instead of writing out their introduction, they went to Flipgrid and just created a video introduction. Hi, my name is, and it kind of boosts or enhances that whole social engagement, because now we have a face to the person, that we actually see that person talking. So they're introducing themselves. And then we as instructors, myself and Ms. Hall, we would literally sit together and then reply to that student using a voice thread, a Flipgrid, like say, hey, welcome to the class. And it kind of just enhanced the overall atmosphere of the course when people can see each other and talk to each other. Yes, it was fun. Although I have to admit, myself, and Ms. Hall, we had to take about 5 or 6 takes for some of them, because we'd say something wrong or start laughing or something. Then we're like, okay, take 2. But it's very engaging, I would say, very engaging. So just something to consider. Now, could you use this as a regular threaded discussion? Absolutely. You can pose a question and then the student just answers using some type of voice thread. So, this is just a new approach, and I would suggest at least having the option. That way the student is not forced to use one or the other. They can kind of determine based on their comfort level which they would like to use. Also, incorporating multimedia resources into your questions. That kind of helps reduce the monotony of just purely text-based interactions. Maybe kind of mix it up a little bit. Maybe show some videos. We do this in the IDLE course, where we have a video and then we ask the student to assess the information that's in the video. You can use YouTube videos or graphs, models, images. These are just all different ways that you can kind of take a different approach to the session itself. And the last thing, the 3CQ, this is actually more geared towards peer responses. And the problem sometimes with peer responses is, how do you keep the thread going? How do you keep the discussion going? And this was actually developed by Jennifer Stewart Mitchell, an instructor, I think K through 12, and she actually came up with this 3CQ: compliment, comment, connection, and question, where she requires all her students to include some type of compliment, a specific observation, something they saw in the peer response, and then compliment that, and then comment about some previous response that they might have read, from a different thread or within that thread group. And then the connection part is where they take the information from that peer and then relate it to themselves, something that they can identify with. Maybe I can relate to this because I remember this happened to me. So it kind of makes a connection to from what the peer is saying. It's a direct connection to them and something they can relate to. And lastly, the question. The requirement is to ask a specific question based on the peer response. That's the key. That's what makes the thread continue. And I've seen this work very well, especially even myself, when I put an initial post out there, and then someone might at the very end ask, I saw, you talked about this, do you think this would be appropriate as well? Now, when I'm reading a response to my post with that question, that kind of prompts me to continue the question. So it kind of helps build the threaded discussion, because a lot of times in thread discussion they kind of just die. They just kind of cut off and don't really take on the intended purpose of continuing discussion based on the subject matter. So those are just some new approaches that you can take with that in your peer responses. So, ladies and gentlemen, that pretty much wraps it up. I hope everyone really got something out of this. Like I said, the threaded discussion is such a critical component of the online learning. So therefore, it's really important that we try to gain a better understanding of what it is, how to formulate it, and then how to facilitate a effective discussion forum. So I thank you all for kind of being here, and hopefully we got to do that. Now, I do want to give you some kind of extra information. If any of you are interested in more, we do have available the IDLE course, which is kind of designed for developers and for analyzing and converting traditional training into the online environment or blended environment. We have the Analysis of Learning, the AOL course, kind of guides students through the key elements. This is kind of more the decision-making process in analyzing different components involved in instructional strategy. We also have the ISD, application of ISD. It's kind of goes more in depth into the whole instructional design or instructional systems development process and course design. And we also have our brand new site, relatively new site. And while I'm at it, I will actually kind of stand by, give you the link in here in a second. Paste it in there. This link actually will take you to this site, and here you'll have more information about FACD itself and all the courses that FACD offers, including enrollment procedures and things of that nature. And from this site, you can actually get to the online learning link, which will allow you to access the Learning Innovation Resource Center that we've developed, which is compiled with tons of resources to help you in transferring your courses to the online environment. I do like to give the caveat, though, that site is best viewed on a commercial network. So, ladies and gentlemen, once again, I really appreciate you being here this morning. I hope you got something out of it. And with that, I will sign off and wish you all a very wonderful day. Thank you very much.